Hi, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This is our first session of 3. We're going to be covering non-human identity, the risks, the realities, and how best to manage. I'm Doreen Reedus. I'm one of the co-founders here at Cybersecurity Tribe, and I'd also want to thank our partner for today's event, Oasis. In this first session, which is titled From PAM to Non-Human Identity Management, how technology is opening up new challenges to securing machine-to-machine access, Ryan Frillman, who's joining me, is going to cover the security risks that are associated with relying on cloud service providers and external SaaS products for identity creation. He's going to review the simplicity in which API-centric services can be accessed with just a single click. Right? And that raises important questions about who oversees these vital credentials. The rapid development of technology in the cloud environment unveils unknown risks, which he's going to discuss along with examining the delicate balance of trust and automation when the credentials remain unknown to human operators. So before I introduce Ryan and pass it off, I want to go over a few little housekeeping items. So in the bottom right, you're going to see a chat function. And in that chat function, when you ask something, it's for all participants to see. It's great for collaboration and responding to one another. The questions widget will just go to Ryan and myself. And those questions will field at the end of the session, providing that we have enough time. Outside of that, handouts. If you click the apps link, there's a handout, and within that, there's a variety of pieces of information, some collateral from our partner Oasis, as well as a report on non-human identity management, so you can download those at any point. As soon as I introduce Ryan, I'm going to go ahead and throw a poll up on the screen, and if you guys would just take the time to respond to the poll. Ryan is the CISO of Equifax Workforce Solutions. He leads teams in security across Equifax. He has longevity in cybersecurity leadership, but if I gave you his entire background, it would take the full session. So Ryan, I'm going to go ahead and get that poll up, and then from there, you can take it over. Here we go.
All right. So really looking at conversation here is to get us started as you look at the poll. Is really kind of understanding is how do you treat your non-human, consider to be credentials. And the aspect that we see it all the time is like, again, let me make sure that everybody's on the same page of what we mean by non-human identities. Non-human identities are system accounts, API secrets. What you think of like people put in scripts that literally humans don't have interaction with a lot of times, that they rely on. Well, if there's not a human that's going to be typing it in or changing the password or using it on a day-to-day basis, it's more those system-to-system accounts. So just to get everybody's baseline on from a definition perspective, that's what we're really talking about here is those kind of accounts. And a lot of times too, if you look at it is, what is the risk related to those accounts? I would say let's roll it back. If you look at, where those accounts are being created, and the context of allowing two devices or two systems to communicate to each other, either internally or externally, is where really the risk lies. You get this kind of feeling of, there is not a human interaction, so they may not have the same rigor as those that would have human accounts, because ones may not know those passwords on the top of their head. They're utilizing password keepers or considered to be PAM, privileged access managers, or secrets managers to house those information. Let's really talk about the risk overall related to non-human identities. And really I kind of look at it as, if we look at the context of shadow IT from 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, you would say, hey, that has a lot of complexity. I mean, back at that point in time, you need to have a physical device. You need to have access to the network to plug it in. And you need also to have the capacity for that said system to communicate to either user base internally or those that are externally, meaning in some cases have a web interface. Nowadays, if you look at that from a cloud service provider, anybody can get a SaaS, or consider to be a software as a service. In the context of shadow IT, some of those SaaS providers, SaaS solutions are free, which could be one, maybe beneficial to the company because they don't necessarily have to sign up and have expenditures to pay for those services. But sometimes in the aspect of shadow IT, you look at is anybody can set it up with any credentials and log into those. And sometimes those credentials could be in the aspect of, hey, let's set up an API that have connections between maybe your system. It could be your PC or a server that maybe you have access to that's on-prem, or in the same aspect is it's within the cloud. Whether you name your favorite cloud service provider, we're able to subscribe to those containers or subscribe to those compute devices and communicate to those SaaS providers in the context of shadow IT. There lies some of the risk, because now an individual, maybe an employee, is going outside of the company standards and utilizing those shadow IT devices, in this case, a shadow IT, let's say a cloud service, to communicate to another system utilizing non-human identities. And they may not follow the same. Maybe you have some rigor around your considered to be non-human identities, where now you're outside that aspect. So you look at it as that aspect, and I see some of you look like you are using the same rigor, and some of you are just not sure or say no. Understand that we have a limited that have responded to that considered to be poll. The context is relatively is the risk that we need to know about, and the aspect of, hey, or what are you concerned about? In some cases, a lot of people are concerned about it if you do have that same rigor. For example, let's say you change the password or have it set to a password expiration, it can cause an outage, which is one of those things from a technology perspective is a big loss, meaning it could have an impact to the company if it is a revenue generated service. So some of those things that you have to understand is what's the ease of access to connect those APIs with a click of a button while managing those credentials. In some cases, if you look at a human, non-human identity using APIs, the risk discussion is, well, we're just going to accept the risk because of a human is not utilizing those user credentials, meaning they're not storing them, they're not writing them down, they're not using them day to day. If somebody tries to phish them or call them, they're not relatively going to give those credentials up because they're immediately going to say, I don't know the password, or that is a system. Why would you ask me for those specific credentials? Now, again, if you look at from a threat perspective, yes, our threat actors are being very sophisticated, where they may have a way of their writing or consider how they're talking to those individuals to get those credentials, or more than likely some of those individuals that would set up those credentials would say, hey, there's alarms. I'm not willing to give up that information to somebody that's on the phone. I don't know them. And it kind of go more in that, hey, we're not going to share it. So a lot of entities accept that risk because of, again, it's not known to the human on a regular basis. And some of those are programmatically not even known to the human in general, meaning they're hard coded in either a script or the base code, or even at that same time as well as within the connection themselves. So when we think about it is, hey, I have to type in a username and password every time I log in the system. If it is generated or is a part of a non-human, it's there without their knowledge, meaning it's built into the system itself. And so then you must ask yourself is, hey, does the operations of an impact outweigh the credential misuse? And again, it's per organization, I would say, is how they would utilize. Is it internal? Is it external? How are those services being rendered? Are they automated? Or in the same taxes, hey, I have built into my CI/CD pipeline as that builds up, I have the capability to store it in a secrets manager. So it literally pulls the secrets out of the secret manager and then basically builds in a process. But as I mentioned before, that's where there is standard processes defined as far as in how you look at your non-human identities. This is not the same context of what you don't know. So it's the common cliche of I don't know what I don't know, or the unknowns of the unknowns is where I was discussing the shadow IT. So if an employee or considered being an internal individual sets up a service, they may not know, hey, there is a standard practice. And also too, they say, well, there is a standard practice. However, I'm building in the dev environment, or I'm building in an environment with kind of like a sandbox that may not have the same rigor around there. Well, you have to figure out what that is. It's kind of like again, if you look at it from your CMDB, I got to know all my inventory in order to protect those. So you have to ask yourself, hey, I may accept the risk where I have standards in place because I have enough compensating controls, or in some cases complementary controls in place to lower the risk or make an acceptable risk. But really, we must identify from an inventory, what about those other areas or other non-human identities that you don't know? So you're going to have a little bit of that practice where you have to identify those areas, and also too is have the tools that help you find those kind of conversations where you do have those non-human identities. So I did a little research on this as well. As like, well, Ryan, overall, this has been for ages since computers, always been system accounts. There's always been baked in accounts. What's the overall risk? So did a little bit of research and understand that. And if you look at, for example, some of the reports that come out, either from Verizon, or what's the cost of data breach, they have seen an uptick in those percentages, upward between 71 or 72%. And so as the Verizon data breach that says, hey, there has been an identity that's been utilized to do either a lateral move or entrance into that environment. So if you look at that, if you look at your identities, you can also say, well, if 71% roughly is causing those data breaches, how many of those are non-human versus a human identity? At the same time, as well as evaluating, do you even know where non-human identities are stored or even being managed? So you got to kind of review those of your constant threat and understand is, hey, how am I managing my service accounts? And also too is, if I'm managing them manually, how many of those are being automated? So if you can throw up the next poll, Doreen, I would kind of want to know too, as well as how many are looking at how to automate the management of your service accounts. So kind of looking at from a perspective is, I don't want to manually manage these because they could cause issues, they can cause outages. I'd rather just have a tool do it myself. That way it's kind of one, a human never knows necessarily the credentials. Well, also too is I don't have to think about it because it's all an already automated process that's being performed, that those credentials are being managed accordingly. Maybe I have the same as the previous question. I want to have the same rigor around those, but I don't have to say, all right, at 11:59 on a Saturday night when I know that potentially I'm going to have less traffic, we're all going to reset the passwords all at the same time. And it requires somebody to either connect to your cloud service provider, or in some cases be an on-prem in the business, to click the button that says change the password to this password, and then spend the next 2 hours or an hour to do checkout to make sure there's no problems with that product. So it looks like, I would say half of you all are looking at, the yes perspective of try to automate, which is a good thing. You want to have less interaction. You could always say that there's the other side of the house of more human errors that cause problems within security, whether on purpose or on accident. So if you do have those automation in aspect, you can rely on those to having less error related to a human. So the other aspect too is, if you look at it from how do you support? So with the automation, what I mean by supporting is supporting technology. We look at AI, that's the big buzzword the last year and a half, even though AI has been around for a while, is companies are looking to go faster. They're saying, hey, technology, how can we take advantage of these new technologies and new capabilities, whether it's just being in cloud and overall, or an aspect of being or having AI. So we look at that aspect as proof of concept. How long does it take to get from a POC to production? Because at the same time too, as you look across the industry, the one that gets into production the fastest usually wins, right? Is because of, hey, I have a new service or I have a new capability. More than likely, customers are going to subscribe to those early adopters or earlier services to take advantage. At the same time, too, the first to the market, you have a little bit more of build time, meaning customer usage to your environment that can provide feedback to make your product even better. So it's more advantageous for those credentials to be, or non-human identities to be baked into their products faster, to quicker. Hey, how do we do this? How do we get these system-to-system accounts? Going back to my first point of having the ability to do shadow IT with developers, you kind of have to look at that conversation of how are we getting ahead of that when we can manage those right from the front and says, hey, if you want non-human identities, here's our process on how to get those. At the same time, too, here's the API to connect into that said tool and said device. So you can make sure that when you build, you're utilizing these credentials to the right purpose. At the same time, too, is we understand from an inventory within the security space if we need to trigger. Maybe we see credentials from a threat intel on these non-human identities, and we need to disable that account or disable that service, whatever it may be, or rotate the credentials. We can do that programmatically with automation for our service accounts to support our technology friends and also to our business partners to say they can deliver as fast as they can. At the same time, too, is we have a close eye on these accounts to make sure that there's not going to be an issue going forward. And we also, too, at the same time, too, can review those credentials to understand are they following the processes? And then also we have tools that identify where we are using non-human identities to make sure that they're being reviewed on a regular basis, and at the same time too, as the first poll, following the rigor that we have in place. Now, looking at, for example, inherited risk, where are the keys to the kingdom, or where is the keys to code base? I think that is another risk that we need to look at and evaluate from a non-human identity. We look across the spectrum and we look at top breaches that have occurred within the last maybe even 2 to 3 years. Some of that is because somebody looked through some public GitHubs, posted them on Pastebin, and found some secrets that maybe were built into the code base. And that entity is not utilizing a secrets manager. So sometimes we kind of forget about that fact. And maybe it was code base that was created maybe 2 years ago, or is developed in GitHub as a development aspect of that. And then that same code base was pushed to production. Well, there lies the issue of, we just made the news. We had a security event because of those credentials were posted in that environment. Somebody scanned the GitHub and found those credentials and posted them on Pastebin, or worse, utilized those credentials to exfiltrate some data or do some lateral movement within that environment. So you would have these kind of capabilities where you look at tool base and say, well, what are we doing? Are we just searching through GitHub to ensure that we're finding those credentials? Or at the same time too, is we evaluating how are we managing those non-human identities that we can make sure from an inventory control perspective, we know and understand of the possibility of these credentials of being potentially replaced found within GitHub, that we need to identify of saying we need to turn those off. Or we know at some point they're having a rotation. So if the credentials or secrets are out there, there's a little bit of a risk aspect of it that they're going to be rotated out because of, the rotation that we have in place. So looking at those inherited risk, you also have to look at, is there a trust factor? Right, as I mentioned earlier, with trust factor of automation, if humans don't know the credentials, do we sometimes just say, all right, we just accept the risk? As stated before, human interaction with identities is one of those things that we have to identify. We have to figure out what is and what is not the risk that we're going to accept with non-human identities. So from a gapping perspective, you got to know the risks, the reality, how are you managing the credentials? At the same time as well as, are you or do you have the right tool in place to make sure that you're protecting your environment overall? So I think, Doreen, we can open it up to questions, because I notice we don't have a lot of time here, but I want to make sure we get enough time for questions. Does anybody have any questions that they have immediately based off of what was discussed today?
Brian, we did get 2 questions submitted in the platform. And first of all, thank you so much. There were 2 things you said that really jumped out. Well, there was a lot that jumped out. But when you talked about the research you did into risk, right, and 71%, and if we could quantify that into non-human identities, that would be very helpful, right? Eventually, we'll get to that point. But also when you said, do you know where your non-human identities are even being stored? And I can tell you from conversations that we have with CISOs, many don't. So that's a huge concern. Now, get to the questions, because I do know we're hitting the end of time here. These are great questions. Do you have recommendations on how to communicate the risk of having non-human identities?
Yeah. So, I would look at it the aspect of, pick your favorite framework. I used to be a MITRE employee, so I like the MITRE attack surface or MITRE attack matrix, and just kind of look at theirs where you see anything related to identity, whether it be initial access or credential access, meaning that from an attack perspective, any way they get in and where they see lateral movements, utilize those frameworks and says, hey, from a risk perspective, I can use this non-human identity and potentially do these kind of recourse, meaning go along and do lateral movements or use that a way in to gain access to that system. That way you're explaining the risk it's not, it's not Ryan explaining the risk. These are frameworks that are being utilized to understand what those risks are. And also too, is it helps identify as, hey, we have a gap in some of our areas that we need to improve upon because the risk may not be accepted because of how it's being utilized. And again, utilize that Verizon data breach. There's tons of reports out there from a vendor perspective that you can use to support your, hey, here's the risk to the organization of the non-human identities.
And one more, and then we'll have to wrap up. So they ask, you mentioned platforms that help. Are there specifics you look for when selecting a platform?
Yeah, I look at, depending on your organization, the biggest one is I look for hybrid approach. Like if I'm on-prem or in the cloud, I would literally ask the vendor or ask the tool, hey, I have a little bit of both. Do you support that environment? Because again, you have non-human identities wherever you have compute services. So you could have it on-prem versus in the cloud. Well, at the same time too, as I mentioned about shadow IT, to see if it operates outside your boundary. I mean, yes, you can utilize them with the SaaS platform to connect to. So look at those capabilities within how your environment is built. And then at the same time too is the visibility. Is the tool able to get complete visibility to your environment where you have non-human? Does it have the proper APIs to connect to your systems? Is it compatible with your secrets manager and your privileged access management solution? So you can understand of how it's built out of visibility that, yes, there is connections that you can get. All right, where's my IAM solution? Because most likely that's where it's going to be to start, or where I should be looking at is my credentials. And then where I have, again, as I mentioned, privileged access manager or secrets manager, where I have those solutions in place. You have to have those tools that are able to talk to each other. And then the last one would be is it supportive of our development? Our development team is utilizing these systems on a regular basis. Well, they able to connect to them to build the product. If they can't build it early in the pipeline, then it may not be the right solution for you. But also at the same time, I use all these as points that you as yourself, as you manage in your organization, you would have to ask. Every organization is different, but I would look at these kind of points to help out select the right tool.
Great points. I did see we had a couple of more questions as well as some commentary and questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to address them here, but we do capture that all. So we will get back to everyone via email. Ryan, I want to thank you again. You gave a lot of valuable information, and non-human identities and the management of is just becoming increasingly important for organizations, especially as you noted with recent breaches. So your insights were very helpful. I want to thank our partner, Oasis, for helping us to put this on today. And I do hope that everyone that's participating here or attending here is able to join us in our next session. And that will include CISO Beswit Sumner and Rosie from Oasis. And they're really going to be focusing on the best practices around non-human identity management. So with that, thank you.
Thank you.